How can you prepare yourself and your team for the next global crisis? Our guest today is James Burstall. He is the CEO of Argonon, which is a successful international TV production company headquartered in London, New York, and Los Angeles, producing shows like House Hunters International, Mysteries of the Abandoned, Lost Treasures in Egypt, Attenborough and the Mammoth Graveyard, and The Masked Singer. During his time at Argonon and group label Leopard USA, James has dealt with a variety of existential crises, from terror attacks to recessions, natural disasters, and of course, pandemics. And through them all, he has managed to guide his team out the other side and set strategies for the next time that this happens. And so he is the author of the new book, The Flexible Method, which is what we're going to talk about today, how to prepare yourself to prosper in the next global crisis. So James, welcome to the Leaders of Transformation. We're glad you're here.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be with you today.
It is a pleasure. And it's a little intimidating because I'm like, okay, so we have this international TV producer on our show. I better not mess it up. So anyway, but we're going to have some fun.
It's all about being yourself. Authenticity is king.
That's right. And I don't know how to be anything else. So it's good. So before we dive in, I would love to do a shout out to Tess Woods PR. I always do this. Where, we just appreciate those who are supporting this show. And that, of course, includes our guests, includes the audience, but also includes the podcast booking agents and consultants that connect us with amazing people that we get to have on our show. So thank you to Tess Woods PR for connecting us to James. Now, James, let's dive in and talk about, the entertainment industry. I mean, it was hit pretty hard during the pandemic, shut you down completely. And yet you were able to get ahead of it and also be able to open up faster than anyone else. So talk a little bit about that journey.
Well, COVID was painful for all of us, wasn't it? It was horrendous. We all have our war wounds. And back in March 2020, when the world really went into, massive crisis and we all started experiencing lockdowns, we were confronted by an existential threat in the TV and film industry, which is my industry, because we were being told that no production could happen, maybe for 12 months. Now, if we don't produce, we have no income. We can't pay our bills. We can't pay our people. So it was an existential threat to the very life of our group. And I've been running this group for 20 years. It's my baby. I'm passionate about it. And I have a huge personal and professional responsibility to hundreds of people who are my full-time employees in London, New York, Los Angeles, and thousands of freelancers who work for us all over the world. Literally thousands of people we hire and work with. So we had a huge responsibility to get these people back into work, doing what they love, which is creative programming. So we knew that waiting 12 months was not an option. So the first thing I did is I gathered my generals, my team around me, UK and US, and said, listen, guys, this is really bad news. What are we going to do? How are we going to get our people back into production? And it is quite remarkable when you put your people first like that, when you bring your generals around you, there is an amazing hive mind of intelligence that you can tap into. And of course, the first thing that people said is, well, we have to come up with COVID protocols. We have to come up with safe ways to protect our people and get them back out into production. So we had a big drama coming up for the BBC and a big entertainment show, The Masked Singer, the giant studio show with huge A-list celebrities in it. And we came up with 1,000 different protocols that were going to keep our people safe, which meant putting people into bubbles, obviously mask wearing, taking handles off all of the restrooms so that people were not touching the same handles when they went to the bathroom, having different ways of people being fed, because when you're on location, people need to be fed, but they couldn't be sharing knives and forks and plates and people coming and going in and out of the bubbles. That was not an option. And my legal and commercial team and my ops team came up, honestly, with the most incredible Bible of how we might do this. So we went back to our major clients at the BBC, ITV, two major channels in the UK in this instance, and said, we think we can do this. We think we can protect our people. And we are confident that we're going to put systems in place where people are going to be safe. And you know what? They trusted us. And we did get back out into the field. We shot a drama all outside pretty much. It's a show about a magical scarecrow for the BBC. And then we shot the Masked Singer, which was all inside. And it was really bizarre for our talent, A-list celebs on the panel and the host, all of whom who are used to working with a giant audience, who were roaring with laughter and backward and forward, the banter that takes place in a live studio show. They were making jokes into an empty, dark room with like 2 camera operators wearing masks. I mean, it was totally surreal. And indeed, the panel, what panel shows are like on these big shows. They all like banter and they riff off each other. They were all separated by giant perspex screens. But you know what? They rose to the challenge. They said, this is weird, but it's weird for everybody on the planet. And right now, people around the world need something that's going to make them feel good. They need to know that we are battling on despite everything that's going on in the world. And actually, after a day and a half, and I interviewed one of the main hosts on the show, they just decided to go for it. And it became exuberant. And they thought, you know what? This is some of the best work we've ever done because we are doing it despite everything. And they came up with a fantastic show. And we delivered both shows. Nobody got sick. We never got shut down. And we delivered. So it sent out very important messages around the industry in Hollywood and in the UK as well. And people realized that, it is possible to get into production. And something I will say is that we shared all of our findings very willingly across our industry. And many people shared back. There was lots of hive minds working all across the planet. It was very, very collaborative. And people collectively came up with very, very detailed protocols, which then were able to roll out across the world. So actually our whole sector was able to get back into work relatively quickly. It was not easy, but it was possible.
Well, it's such a huge task, what you were just talking about, like literally 1,000 different things to do. And I think a lot of times when we get into crisis, I know for myself, the natural inclination, what do? Self-preservation. We hide out. You think about the 2008, 2009, crash. Everybody's like diving for cover, and yet that's the very opposite of what you need to be doing in that moment. And you demonstrated that. And I love, as I was reading your book, story after story of the different examples and how you were saying like nobody got sick, nobody, didn't have issues. And you actually set a protocol in place, like you just said, that others could follow and get everybody back to work. And even just showing and demonstrating that we can figure this out, the creativity, this is the creative space, the creativity of being able to do a show without an audience. I mean, we've all watched shows that were very audience driven, that during COVID, it was like weird. It was surreal for them. You could tell that it was surreal, but everybody had that empathy because, to use the word that we were talking about earlier, authenticity, is that people were being authentic and they were figuring it out. We were all in this together. And I know you talk about that also in your emails that you would send to your team about, the fact that it was important for you to let them know that we were all in this together. So I love all of that you're doing. And I think back to let's wind back to what was the thinking, what was the thought process that you had as the leader to be able to actually engage in that conversation and dialogue with your team. What was going on for you? What did you believe to be true? What did you believe the values that were important to you that allowed that to happen? Because that didn't necessarily happen across the board.
No. The most important message of the book, and the thing that we deal with actually first in the book, is you have to put your people first. You have to make sure that your people are safe. So when we realized that COVID was really serious and that we were probably at some point going to go into lockdown, this is like early March 2020, the first thing we did, we moved early. We moved 2 weeks before lockdown happened in the UK and US. The first thing we did is we sent people home and we said, take time out, get yourself to a safe place, check your elderly parents are okay, make sure the kids have got food on the table and they feel secure. Then let's make sure you've got Wi-Fi, and if you haven't, let's see what we can do about that. Then I decided to start a daily email around the group because we have many hundreds of full-time staff and thousands of freelancers who work for us. Many of them are in their 20s and are living in far-flung parts of the planet, and some of them in like rented accommodation in like a rented apartment, maybe miles from their own family. So they were very frightened. And we all felt scared. I did too. We did not know what was happening back in March 2020. So I started this daily communication of basically saying, and this is where the authenticity piece is so important. I said from the get-go, we do not have all the answers. We are listening carefully to what governments around the world are saying. We're looking very carefully at the medical advice to make sure that people are safe, and where possible, then we quickly started to get access to whatever was available. This was long before vaccines, of course, were available. And then I said, we as a team are going to start putting plans in place, which beginning will be kind of minute by minute, one afternoon or the following morning, very, very short time frames, but we will do this by this time. And we've got your back. We don't have all the answers, but we will get there. And then those time frames became day by day, and then week by week, and then eventually month by month. So it became very manageable for people to understand that there was a roadmap, that the senior management of my group had people's backs. We did not have all the answers, and things were going to be a bit frightening, and it was pretty bumpy at times. But nonetheless, there was a sense that we are responsible and we're authentic and we're in this together. And you know what happened? People rolled up their sleeves and did the most incredible things. I mean, people went the extra mile. People worked so hard to come up with solutions, to come up with new ideas, to offer things that we maybe had never thought of, that we then put into the pot. And then I created an emergency team at the top of my organization. In the UK, we call it a COBRA team. It's like what governments use in times of emergency. And in that team, there's 5 people plus me, come from operations, legal, commercial, creative, business, finance. And these are not people who are yes people. These are very smart business people who will tell me the truth. And sometimes that truth was painful. I didn't want to hear it. But as a leader, you have to be willing to hear the truth. You don't have all the answers. No one is, I don't believe in that kind of top-down, kind of old style of, the boss has to know all the answers and then kind of feeds down and everybody does what the boss says. Because, of course, the boss doesn't have all the answers. The boss needs help. And I certainly needed help. But, of course, by reaching out, first of all, to that very tight group and then to the wider group of management, I was able to access a lot of very, very thoughtful planning, which we then fed in, came up with plans, put things into action, and came out with very good positive outcomes. I will say in my sector, there's a lot of independent producers, and we are an independent production group. Across our industry, my contemporaries took a 19% hit. So that's a big hit, nearly 20%. One of my main competitors took a 30% hit. So that was a big, they were really battered by COVID. My group took a 9% hit, so less than half the average. Why is that? And I really do believe is we put our people first, and people went the extra mile, came up with incredible plans, and we were brave. We took difficult decisions. What I will say about the flexible method, and I try to outline in the book in very clear steps what we recommend just from experience, what does work. None of it is easy. You have to make tough decisions. If you make those tough decisions and follow them through with fierce resolve, you will come out stronger and fitter.
Yeah, I love this people first, because a lot of times I hear a lot, because there's a lot of guests and leadership coaches and consultants that are on this show. And I hear a lot about this people first and how important it is. It's a topic that is very prevalent today. And yet, what does that actually mean? I love how you put your people first, literally even before yourself. Like, I know you took a pay cut, you talk about it in your book, and putting your people's first was like, that became the mission. And in the process of doing that, the mission of the business got sorted out as well. It got served. And the other piece was in that, of course, communication was big. And the other piece was the vision. You had a vision. There's a scripture in the Bible that says, where there is no vision, people perish. And I think that's so true. And we saw that where people went to self-preservation defense mode versus what can we look at? What can we keep our eyes fixed on? And I hear that as an underlying theme to what you were doing, and in your book, what you talk about. I love to actually talk about, because in your book, you don't just talk about the pandemic, you talk about other things that have gone on, different crises that you've been through. And I never really thought about the entertainment industry this way, but you actually find yourself quite often in situations, because you're operating all around the world and your teams can be in, far off remote places and having to deal with this. How do you recognize the difference between a legitimate danger and an overreactive fear? Because there's a lot of noise in the world right now, a lot of fear-based media. And how do you navigate through and say, we need to act on this and we don't need to be concerned about that?
I think this is true for life, right? The world is full of noise and full of kind of scary stuff. And I think, just me as an individual, I quite often take a time off digital media. I do digital detox sometimes, for even as a month at a time, because you can become very easily overwhelmed and then buffeted by winds. And therefore you lose all sense of perspective. And that's no good for you as an individual or as a member of your family or a friend. And it's hopeless for a business. You cannot have lack of clarity in your leadership. I talk a lot about calm, purposeful leadership, and that does require cutting through the noise. So we didn't come up with a flexible method just out of the blue in the middle of COVID. We started the process back in the credit crunch in 2008-9. And I'd actually read a story from Richard Branson, who's a very brilliant global entrepreneur. He runs Virgin Atlantic, among many other things, I'm sure you know. And he wrote an article in the Times which said, you absolutely must put your people first. And that really stuck with me. And I remember going into the office on the 1st of January 2009 and gathering my team around me and saying, listen, the production sector's just basically crashed, as has probably the whole world. There's no money in the advertising industry. So all the big commercial channels, whether it's Discovery or, the giant broadcast networks, they have no money. So we're not going to get commissioned anytime soon. What are we going to do? Well, the first thing we're going to do is we're not going to let any of you go. What we are going to do, though, is we're not, unfortunately, going to be able to bring freelancers in to do jobs. We make a lot of long-running shows, Cash in the Attic, House Hunters International. These are long-running formatted programs. And normally we bring in a lot of extra freelancers to come and help us out producing or directing episodes. I said, we're not going to do that. So all the people who are currently working in the company are guaranteed a job. But we are going to ask you to roll up your sleeves and do slightly different jobs from what you're currently doing. So someone who is a showrunner, who's basically the top of the show, I would say, do you mind going out and becoming a director, a field producer? To a field producer, I'd say, do you mind coming into the edit and becoming an edit producer for a bit? An edit producer, I'd say, do you mind coming in and doing casting? So basically meant stepping back perhaps a year or two in their career trajectory, but they're perfectly capable of doing it because they did it 2 years prior. What people realized is that we were protecting their jobs so they could still pay their mortgages and feed their families, and that they were part of a collective bigger mission, if you like, to keep the business ticking over whilst things were so sticky. And actually, to be honest, people really enjoyed it, because those people who are now, risen to the heights of, becoming an executive, some of them actually really enjoyed going back out in the field and shooting 2 or 3 episodes of one of our formats, because that keeps your hand in, right? If you're creative, it's quite nice to remind yourself of these processes. And people knew that there was a bigger vision, and you talk about that. It is very, very important as a leader to give your people hope. And one of the ways to give people hope is to let them know that there is a greater goal. There is something that we're all heading for. You are kindling a sense of hope. We don't know today exactly what's going to happen, but we are a multi-award winning production group. We do a great job. We have amazing clients. They're also having trouble right now, but it won't be like this forever. We lived through 9/11. It nearly killed us, but we did get there. We lived through Hurricane Sandy. That nearly killed us. We've lived through the California wildfires. That nearly killed us. These are really tough experiences that people in our teams all around the world have had to go through. But we do not succumb. We always come out somehow the other side. And, the human race, thank goodness, is incredibly resilient. And businesses can be resilient too. But you know what? You do have to have that flexibility. You have to be willing to move and willing to pivot and be agile. And if something isn't working right now at this moment in time, you have to be willing to let it go and try something different.
So that actually brings me to, and I'm going to show this for the people watching in the video, the book, The Flexible Method. How did you name this? Why flexible? There's so many other words you could have used.
Yeah, flexible is a very powerful word. And in many big companies, giant, listed companies and Wall Street and elsewhere, they lose a sense of flexibility and they lose it at their peril. There are many, many big companies, and I won't name any, but if you go to any sort of business school, and I've done study at Stanford and Oxford and elsewhere, there are case studies that will come out of your ears on companies that started off being innovative and disruptive and willing to try new stuff. And then they become established, and then they become fat, and then they become heavily laden, and they get stuck in their ways. And actually, the reason Hachette, who is the publisher, who were big, they're one of the top 3 publishers in the world. One of the reasons they went with they said that they'd publish this book, is that they said it's very unusual and counterintuitive for a television producer in the production sector to write a book about crisis management. Who'd have thought? I'm not Merrill Lynch or, a risk manager at all, although I do run a business which is buffeted by crises like so many of us all the time. And the reason that it makes sense is that the production sector is incredibly agile. We are willing to pivot, to change, to try new things. We operate also on very tight margins. And when something doesn't work, we can't afford to continue with it. We have to change tack. And actually, there are many, many large companies. It behoves them to listen and I hope read. In fact, I'm getting amazing feedback that I'm getting a lot of people saying, what, we do need to have this agility built into our culture, a willingness, and senior management need to listen and be willing to, if something isn't working, maybe that's because it's not fit for purpose any longer. Maybe you need to try a different tack.
So there's a couple of things I wrote down. First of all, just for context standpoint, how many people do you employ at your company? And of course, you've got freelancers as well.
Yeah, we have about 600 full-time staff across the UK and US, and then many thousands of freelancers.
Yeah. So there's a point where, and you mentioned Richard Branson, and I've read some of his books, and how he talks about staying small, growing smaller as he grows bigger. How do you notice that there was a point where maybe that innovation, you had to be more intentional about it in terms of size, right? So companies get to a certain size. We often say that they get to a certain size and they become less innovative. Where is that tipping point where they need to really be careful about, obviously throughout the whole process, but specifically there are like tipping points where they need to be careful for. Yeah.
I think crises actually are incredibly invaluable in that regard. A chief operating officer I worked with back in the end in 2009 at the time of the credit crunch, and I featured her in the book. She talks about how, when a company gets established, you can slip into some bad habits. And she talks about stationery and staples and paper clips. And, you can suddenly realize that, hang on a minute, we've been ordering stacks and stacks of paper and stacks of paper clips because it's easy and we got a bit lazy. And maybe we've got a few extra staff knocking around the place that perhaps there isn't a role for them any longer because the business has changed. And I think that is just a natural tension that happens in any business. You go through cycles, and it happens every few years that you grow and grow and grow, and then you probably develop a bit of fat on the land, if I'm honest. And then something like a nasty crisis comes along and makes you think, hang on a minute, we used to be startup. We need to get back to startup mode. Lean and mean, keep your overheads as low as you possibly can. Make sure that all of your people are significantly incentivized, being stretched so that they're excited and enjoying their jobs and doing their best work. And then you can make sure that, you keep your margins at a good level. And these crises, they are painful, but they get us to look at ourselves again. And that introspection actually is important. I talk in the book about open heart surgery. When we entered COVID, we had to go back through every single line of every single budget across the entire organization and go, can we afford that? Is that the right way to do things? One thing I will say that is completely transformative, again, thank you, COVID, despite all the war wounds, You talk about House Hunters International. Back in March 2020, that show's on every day on HGTV. It's a hugely popular show, as you know. We were told there's no way you're going to film, anywhere around the planet. And we were like, well, we need to. We've got a lot of people who work on this show and the audience love it. And of course, the channel wanted us to produce it. So the first thing we did is we came up with a network to check all across the planet when countries were going in and out of lockdown. And we discovered that, South Korea came out of lockdown and New Zealand went into lockdown. Finland came out of lockdown and Guatemala went into lockdown. It was this constantly evolving story. And on a daily basis, I had two very brilliant women, actually, one in London, one in New York, who were tracking lockdowns across the planet every single day and sharing it across the organization. So that meant that we could go, you know what? We want to do this show in Guatemala, but we can't this month because they've just shut down. But New Zealand's just opened up. Or you know what? Things are looking up a bit better in South Asia. That maybe we'll go to Thailand. So Southeast Asia. So we'd go to Thailand and we would shift our filming accordingly. There was another benefit, which meant that we realized we couldn't fly people there because getting on airplanes was just not an option. So we then went out and we found incredibly talented production teams, directors, producers, camera operators, sound recordists, fixers, the whole shebang, and we'd find them local. And there was a bit of a snobbery in our industry prior to COVID. It's like, well, if they're in, Southeast Asia or in Africa or, parts of Europe, maybe they're not as good as they would be if they were based in LA or New York or London. Maybe let's not go there. We'll fly our people in. That costs a lot of money. And it means our staff permanently live with jet lag. And it's really bad for climate change. It's terrible, racking up thousands and thousands of MRs. So suddenly, as a direct result of necessity, we then set up 100 filming crews all across the planet in local countries. So we were able to upskill them. That's great for developing countries. Suddenly, these people were producing primetime American television, whether they lived in New Zealand or South Africa or Eastern Europe or where it was it might be. We had to train them, and it didn't happen overnight. But I have an amazing senior executive team in New York, and they rolled up their sleeves and they said, we need a show out of South Africa, or we need a show out of Belize. We're going to have to find a crew locally, and we're going to have to train them up. And they did. So now things we've moved on. We won't go back to flying people all over the planet, not least because of climate change. We've now got 100 amazing crews across the planet who are producing primetime American television. We have this enormous network thanks to COVID.
Reminds me of the Chinese character for crisis and opportunity is apparently it's the same. And the huge opportunity, wow, to be able to create 100 teams across the world. Now you actually not just came back to where you were before, but you're so much further ahead. And it truly is a blessing. I mean, every single example that you use in the book, and I know, for my own life, it's like when you have crisis, you get the opportunity to learn and grow something new. It's like challenging your muscles. That's really powerful. Speaking of shows, there was a show that you did, Cash in the Attic. You talk about in your book how you brought that back. So, you were mentioning about the staplers and looking at the notepads. And I know you did that, like you went around and said, okay, from that example, that lady, that you went around and said, okay, we have enough staples for the next 5 years. We don't need to go buy any more staples. And it's a little thing, but how often is that true? I've seen that. And I'm half Dutch, so I'm a little bit frugal. So I'm aware of those things. I've always been aware of those things, and thinking about it, even from a product line or a service line, to look at something that may not have been in production for a while, but going back to that, repurposing it and applying it, that takes innovation, that takes creativity, ingenuity. So talk a little bit about how you were able to do that and where that's become another opportunity for you.
Yeah. Well, one of the things we knew back in March 2020 was that because there was no production, we had to think every possible way of getting money in the door. Some of our crews, fortunately, had accelerated filming prior to the tsunami coming across continental Europe and hitting us in the US and then the UK. And so they were able to get into edits and start editing like crazy. And then we moved edits remotely so people could edit from home and so on. So that was one way to get money in the door, because we could then deliver those shows. But another way was like, well, what have we got in our attic? What's sticking around in the attic that maybe could be reimagined? And Cash in the Attic is a very successful show. We produced that show all over the world. It sold to 167 countries. But it had got rested. All shows do. They have a shelf life and then they get rested for a bit. So I'm passionate about that. It was actually one of the shows that got us off the ground in the first place back in 2001. But anyway, it was resting in 2020. And I thought, well, let's reimagine it for a contemporary audience. We knew everybody was at home. So people might be sitting around in their homes thinking, well, what can I do? I'm stuck here for the time being. Is there stuff that I can go and clear out? Is there a bit of kind of reorganization I can do? Maybe the garage needs out, or maybe there's stuff in the basement or under the beds or in the attic, whatever. And people were short of money because a lot of people were not working. People were stuck at home and thinking, well, how am I going to pay my bills? So on a number of levels, we thought, well, this could be timely. And we took the idea out, and Discovery said, look, we love the idea, and yeah, let's do it. So we produced a show in the US, and then we produced a show in the UK, and again, sold it around the world. So it's a bit like you've got assets hiding in your bottom drawer that you don't know about. Dig them out. You never know. You might be able to reinvent them for a new purpose or a new audience in the case of TV industry.
Yeah, brilliant. Such a brilliant idea. And yeah, I just thought that was fantastic. So we talk about this flexible method in your book. There's a number of different steps. You've talked about them here, the Cobra team, communication, values. What have we not talked about that is important to talk about for leaders?
One thing I would like to
for leaders that are really
say is that I wanted the book to be purposeful and useful for the broadest possible audience.
Yeah.
And most people who are reading the book don't work in television, and I realize that it's a slightly rarefied world, although it is relevant because there are transferable skills. So actually, I made a considerable effort and went out and interviewed some incredible leaders across industry: hospitality, gyms, real estate, finance, medicine, politics, agriculture even, because I wanted to gather intelligence and gather some brainwaves, frankly, from people out there who were doing their own flexible method, but maybe hadn't at that point called it that. So I was very inspired by the farming community in the Carolinas, which is one of the hurricane belts of the US. And, year after year, all through the end of the 90s and into the early noughties, were being buffeted by hurricanes, and it was damaging their industry. What they decided to do, and there's a chapter in the book, is collaborate and connect. They reached out to all of the pork industries across the entire Carolinas and worked out that there are different people that were expert at different things. Some were experts at flying helicopters. Some were experts at, managing the animals. Some were experts at, shipping in food. So they set up this whole network, and suddenly what had been a very disparate, disconnected community of professionals, they suddenly all kind of started working together and came up with a plan. And one of the things they now can do is they can spot much, much earlier when a hurricane is coming, and they can plan much better, so the damage is much more limited. So it's not so devastating for people's livelihoods or indeed the animals. So that was one example. Another example was this amazingly inspiring political leader in Oklahoma City, who is actually the first Native American mayor. He's only 40. He's a Republican, impressive man. And he talked a lot about how it was very important to protect his very diverse community in Oklahoma City. And he was worried about people's health outcomes. And he decided to really ramp up the protective measures. So he did impose very strict lockdowns. He also then started a campaign of communicating on Twitter in a contained way, not wanting to frighten people, but to make people know that their leadership cared about them, had their backs. And that was why he was imposing these very stringent lockdowns. And it was different from the governor in Oklahoma State, who was also Republican, but had very different views about the right approach. Anyway, David Holtz took this view, and he managed things very carefully, very tightly. And you know what? The outcomes, and it's a terrible way to have to measure this, but the fatalities in Oklahoma City were some of the lowest of any city in the US. He stepped up, he protected his people, and he saved thousands of lives. I found that really moving. This man stuck his neck out and he really, really went for it. And he stuck to his values, his beliefs, and his people. He was, the job of a politician is to protect the people, right? And he did protect his people. And you know what? There was an election a couple of years later, he won with the landslide.
Yeah.
So these things matter. And so I was very inspired by that in the book. And there are many, many other stories from all sorts of different industries, like I described. So I really hope that people will be able to find some useful ideas in the book that they can transfer to whatever industry they're in.
Yeah. Last question, possibly, unless I come up with something else. But the last question is positivity. I hear in all that you're talking about that positive hope that you talk about for the future. As leaders are planning for the next global crisis that's going to come, how do they manage between imagining the unthinkable and staying positive and in a constructive space in the moment?
There is, in a way, nothing worse than inviting some of your senior management team to a meeting to talk about the next cataclysm. It's not a nice thing. It's not a nice meeting to invite people to.
Yeah.
But you know what? Strength is in knowledge, and there's strength in a plan. So when we've drawn people together across the Argonon organization and we've prepared and we've talked about having a crisis management plan, what's going to happen if all of our IT goes down and we can't communicate? What's going to happen if our offices, if they get flooded? And we have talked about all of these things, and we need to continue to talk about these things on a regular basis. When you have a plan, you can absolutely alleviate anxiety because you know that there is backup. For example, we all use WhatsApp, so we know that we can communicate as a wider group if for some extraordinary reason something goes down and we can't communicate. So there is comfort, I think, in acknowledging that we do live in a time of perma-crisis. There are crises happening, not one after the other anymore, but kind of all of the time. If it isn't Ukraine, it's the terrible things happening in the Middle East. If it's not the next recession, it's inflation, it's the cost of living crisis, it's interest rates, whatever. Gosh, they keep coming, don't they? And I think that is a fact of the world that we live in now. But when you have a plan and you've got people around you, you've got your back, you can be pretty confident that you're going to come out okay.
Yeah. So I do have one more question. So where do you see you're like going forward? You look in the future for your organization. What do you see?
Well, I am a hopeful, optimistic person. I think we're very blessed to be living in the time that we're living. There are so many wonderful things in this world. I also love my industry. We are very creative. We can tell incredible stories about so many different things. And in my do everything from documentaries to music programming to reality shows to entertainment to drama, scripted drama. And I love all those things. And I love being able to mix between the two. There's nothing better for me than working with A-list talent who are exceptional at what they do. I'm not particularly dazzled by celebrity in and of itself. What I love is brilliant people who are passionate about their craft, will come into a room with me and we'll come up with something amazing, and we'll bring others around the table and we can create exceptional work that millions of people around the world love to watch. There's nothing better than that. I love it. And it can be Cash in the Attic, which is, comforting and a kind show that millions of people, tens and hundreds of millions of people actually watch over the planet. Or it can be really challenging work that makes people think differently about the world we live in. And I do like doing both. And I think it's my responsibility actually as a broadcaster to do both. So I'm passionate about all of that and continue to do that. So I'm not going anywhere anytime soon.
Good.
I am excited. I'm actually doing a course at MIT at the moment about AI. AI is a very, very exciting opportunity that is already disrupting our world. And I do see AI as a very exciting tool and collaborative piece of technology that humans will be able to work with, that is going to enhance what computers could ever do on their own, and what humans could ever do on their own. And I do believe that there's a very exciting future where computers and humans are going to come together and collectively come up with exceptional things that are going to push us way out of our comfort zone and into new places that I'm excited about.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, James, thank you so much. It has been such a pleasure. And I'm just going to encourage all of our listeners and viewers to go get a copy of The Flexible Method. It's on Amazon. It's everywhere where books are sold. It is a brilliant, practical guide to follow step by step, very in depth, with amazing stories in there, real life stories, not theory. This works, and it'll work for you as well. So prepare your teams, prepare yourself for what's ahead. And we didn't get into it much, but even just like how to take care of yourself as a leader, how to make sure that the mental health of your team is intact, that their emotional health is intact. We alluded to it here, but it's all in this book. And so I encourage you to go get a copy of that. And James, again, thank you so much. And I love how you're just always growing, always innovating. Now it's on to learning about AI and how you can use that. And that's what's going to keep you at the top of your industry for sure. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
It was a pleasure. And we'll make sure, of course, the links are also in the show notes. You can go on theflexiblemethod.com is also the website if you want to learn more about the book. And again, that book is going to be on Amazon and everywhere books are sold. So again, thank you. And I always say that leaders of transformation take action. So if you're listening to this and you're wondering, okay, wow, so there's a lot that we covered here, a lot of places that you can start somewhere. Start somewhere today. Maybe it is about looking at that Cobra team for yourself and saying, maybe I need to bring my team together. I don't need to have all the answers. If I'm the leader, I don't need to have all the answers. I can bring smart people around me and we can figure this out together. Start somewhere today, because if you don't do something today, then this just gets shelved and it gets forgotten, and you just carry on until the next crisis hits and you think, oh, I wish I had done something. So I encourage you to do something today to set yourself up and set your team up and your business up for success in the future. We encourage you to do that. We'd love to hear your stories. You can go on leadersoftransformation.com. Of course, you can find us all over social as well. And we'd love to hear how this has impacted you. Until next time, have a great day.